Hi, you okay?
Hmm?
You didn't, you're okay? You didn't go too far on your bike or anything?
Oh no, no, I'm enjoying the bike. The bike thing is going well. Yep, I'm back. Yeah, I'm back in motion. I was kind of off it for a while I had a flat tire, but yeah, now I'm back. So I'll probably go I'm gonna try to go 20 miles ish a day and see how that
But you're exceedingly fragile, right?
I don't know, am I?
Oddly enough,
Maybe
I've
emotionally.
rec-
Yes, yeah, I'm a little bit I'm a little bit fragile.
oddly
Although
enough,
fragile has lasted quite a while. So it's apparently possible to be fragile and still persist for long periods of time.
um, I've recently changed from the middle span of topographic ocean back to the middle span of the relay,
Mm,
which I think overall was my favourite singular album as opposed to collected. Although Close to the Edge got votes.
yeah,
Um,
close to the edge is hard to beat. I might put Relayer above Topographic Oceans too. Yeah.
yeah,
Although
well, the problem there, I think, is my first Yes album was the triple Yes songs collection.
yeah, yeah.
So then I had to go back
Hmm.
and not quite. It wasn't quite a research decision, but I picked up Trilogy by Emerson Lake and Palmer
Mm.
in either 72 or 73, something like
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
And then it just grew. And then,
Yep.
yes, particularly changed a lot.
Yeah.
By the time it got one or two albums past Patrick Moran's taking
Ah,
over from Wakeman and Co.,
yeah.
I sort of dropped away and sort of returned to much more British fare and went backtracking on Jethro Tull, so that I ended up with Heavy Horses being
Hmm.
the singular album with like and then a singular old style disc.
Hmm.
And it's got like 12 tracks on it, 10 tracks, 12 tracks.
Yep.
Um, but I did like the way that I could put on an old style mono player two 12-inch discs, proper Ghost. The
Hmm.
only problem is you can't play all four tracks. You've got to go two and two.
Yeah.
Um, and, and when Dad realised that that was going to be a persistent habit, it was okay. Your record player's got a jack. Here's a set of headphones and use the jack.
My parents were actually very tolerant of me playing Yes and Jethro Tull and actually my first introduction to that whole genre was the Myths and Legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, the Wakeman album.
Oh, oh dear. So
Well, yeah,
you couldn't have made
which
it.
I thought was a great album, although he did try to sing, which was problematic.
Well, yes, problematic. So it wasn't six, seven wives of Henry VIII. Yeah,
The sixth, actually, that was my second Wakeman album, yeah, which I
yeah.
thought was much on a much higher level than Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Yeah. No, I must admit, as much as I like the the ability on the keyboard, didn't think he was that good on his own compared to, say, the original Tubular Bells with Mike Oldfield,
Hmm.
where you get a singular context, where you have a singular creative person
Hmm.
who, in in the original Tuba Bells. He plays it all. And then, of course, in 74, 75, the BBC convinces Mike Oldfield to do a live play. So he has to go round and collect 20
That
other
band,
long-haired
yeah.
players.
Right.
Play, because he can't do it all on his own.
Well, how do you tour? And that was a problem that Jacob Collier had when he decided to, I guess his first tour he kind of did the sort of the in my room thing where he sort of played everything and used some technological tricks. But his second tour he actually went out with a band.
Yeah, and so I think there's a big difference in what does a single creative person do
Mm-hmm.
versus a team, so that you end up with what's the difference between, say, Queen versus Jethro Tull versus the likes of Mike Oldfield and Alan Wakeman.
Mm-hmm.
But now, oddly enough, I mentioned this feel for I like big tracks that are not particularly verbal, because the harder hearing means I can hear the music, but I can't always get the actual lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
I can get the music of the lyrics, the beat and the harmony, etc., but I can't always get the word.
Mm-hmm.
So unless I'm really close in terms of headphones and the mono player,
Right.
and there's it's taken me 25 repetitions to get the words to Fragile, say.
Right.
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 Even though we're on the back of the album, right?
Yeah. I always had less trouble with Yes than the person that I had the most trouble with was Elton John. I could never figure out what the hell he was singing about.
Yeah, I never bothered with him other than he was on the radio and the telly at the time. But so I mentioned it in passing to one of my colleagues who I was having dinner with, and his either his girlfriend or his wife, or subsequently his wife. And it turns out she's a piano person at the Royal College of Music. I did, and she said in the conversation, she says, "Oh, so do you know about Ludovico Einaudi?" And I said, "No, who's that?" And it turns out to be an existing old Milan Italian who manages to speak smattering of English. And he writes effectively modern piano music for no voice, and a good half plus of it is let's have some strings and let's have some drums.
Yep.
And the odd bit of something else. But I don't think there's ever been a saxophone or anything in it. But for COVID, with all the shutdown and all the rest of it, he because he moved to his farm outside of Milan, he went for a walk each day and produced an album that I don't think has ever really come out as an album, that had about 20 tracks. But for each of the 7 days, there's a whole CD's worth of an album of a selection of those 20 odd tracks. So you get 12, but you get whatever the track name is, version 3, flavor 4. And so within that one album, you might get one track 2, sometimes 3 times in different flavors. And then 2 or 3 days later, you might get another version. And I suppose the conceit is that these evolved over 7 days, although it probably took him a good couple of months, to be honest. But they're really, there's a YouTube version of it, of the whole thing, and it's like 6 hours and 10 minutes in total. And and because they're all of the same theme, and you've got individual tracks repeated, it's rather like the concerto begins with a B by Mozart. Brandenburg.
Mhm.
Something similar. Because this 6 hours and 5 minutes, although technically speaking, it's actually one piece of music, you could get lost. So I play it, freeze it when I finish, when I'm reading or whatever, and disappear down to our reading or taking notes or doing whatever else I am. And then come back to it, pick it up from where I just left off, and it gives me a 6 hour slot chunk. And it's really quite effective, I found.
Interesting. Yeah, I found it on Spotify as 12 songs from.
Yeah, well,
so it's only an hour and 9 minutes on.
I don't think I've ever heard music described as quite effective before.
There you go. It does what it's meant to do.
Yes, I mean it's. So I obviously clearly have to put the YouTube thing in the chat, and it's the URL didn't work. It just put down the last bit of.
So tangential to this, I will mention, not for reading purposes necessarily, but Max Richter did a piece, which is an 8-hour piece called Sleep, which is, you don't have to sleep with it, but it is a gorgeous piece of minimal composition.
Yeah. I mean, if you use YouTube to do your selection, if you've been playing Ludovico, you often get Richter come up as being.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then, of course,
there's a whole. I listen to a lot of like Max Cooper and other folks in that sort of area. Yeah, but I don't think I've seen this one, so now I'm gonna
and
add it to the list.
And I know his music across. He's got about 20 albums, of which a couple are sort of concert remixes. One of the other ones you get on YouTube, there's a Berlin concert, open air concert in Berlin. And whoever put up a YouTube one, because it's an unofficial bootleg type thing, didn't put it in order of what the concert was. So the Berlin song is like the closing song of the Berlin concert. Is that like minute 40 something off their YouTube? So you get all this interjection from Ludovico doing his little bit of English that he can talk, saying about thank you for coming back. Sun's going down, but we're all still warm and dry. And a couple of bits of music, and he launches into this. And this song is called Berlin Song or whatever. And although he's on the piano, he's got 4 or 5 other people, mostly on drums and stuff. It's a real thumper of a. And my problem is if I ever lapse into letting that play instead of 7 days and I'm in the library, I get looked at. Because it's not a tap, 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 it's a. But anyway.
So to move to counterfactual stories. We've got this week we've got Zhang He attacking Tenochtitlan, which was odd.
But is the admiral any good on land that he's on sea?
Well, he when his first treasure fleet was was accompanied by like 28,000 troops. So there does seem to be some.
You got higher technology, a lot of higher technology equipment than would have been available to the Aztecs.
Well, that's all being one of them.
So the thing about the thing about the Aztecs was it was, like although the story is more told with respect to the Inca in 1532. There was still a huge element of disease involved in, there was kind of plague in Tenochtitlan when the Spaniards came back, with the Tlaxcalans after over a year after, I think, the Noche Triste being, kind of thrown out and almost wiped out. So, yeah. Although it is, I guess I like I like the point that he makes about, because when he talks about Zhang in the and he's riffing on the idea of that 1420 book of Menzies, that he says, let's think of this like, as the way we were thinking of Von Daniken, and just use it to to sort of ask why or why not, which I thought was kind of effective. I liked that.
Well, I mean, he sort of shortcuts the whole thing at the end, saying, "Yeah, the reason was geography." It's like,
right.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, okay, the Pacific is much wider. The Pacific is vastly wider than the Atlantic, and it's just
Well, one of the things Diane mentioned last week, that he was getting more and more impressed with the graphs that were popular. And like the next bit of reading I did, I ended up with graph 6.1, which is where he's doing all the Pangloss cross-referencing and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I was quite disappointed in that. I thought that was a terrible graph with 2 lines. But the thing about there was the depression from sort of the middle of the end of the Roman Empire to the actual end of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Northwest Europeans trying to creep out of the Dark Ages, and Alfred the Great that doesn't get mentioned because we're no longer an empire. The thing that I've bounced off and went, Canticle or Leibniz solution, the foundation type thing. And then, of course, Louis Startner and the knowledge how to rebuild our world from scratch type book, as in, given there's all this East-West thing, and they were both depressed, they didn't quite drop off the edge properly, completely. So they managed to rebuild themselves. But if they had dropped off a bit more, and therefore civilization would have had to come back out of Africa again, and that delay in repopulating Europe and Asia would have given Kim Stanley Robinson his year of salt and sand solution, such that the Americans would have lifted themselves up to something a bit more. It made me wonder again in terms of, so if there is a collapse coming, what are we doing, and what's the equivalent of the foundation?
Mm.
Where's the island somewhere in that big, dark, deep Pacific?
Mm-hmm.
That is, are we going to put 5,000 intellectuals and historians on the island of Hawaii and hide that?
Mm-hmm. No, clearly it's going to be California.
You can put all of Wikipedia on a thumb drive, man.
And actually, that was one of the things that what's his name, the guy who ran LibreTexts, was always doing. Was he was I forget his name, but I remember he showed me this thing. It was basically a thumb drive, and he said, "I'm taking all of the textbooks that I can get my hands on, and I'm sticking them on this thing so that we can take it into darkest Africa or wherever, and and provide this service to people."
But how many laptops work after 3 years of turbulence and the darkest regions of the Congo type thing?
Right.
So that comes out a lot within the Louis Dartnell book. Is in his conceit is 90% of the population vanish overnight, everywhere, evenly, right? And he gives no explanation of how that happens. It's not a science fiction story. It's for whatever reason, this happens. What happens next? And it's like, well, within a couple of weeks, the freezers and stuff within all the supermarkets are going to go bust.
Mm-hmm.
So the 10% of the people that are left need to clear the frozen food because the fresh food won't last a week. And then clear the canned food and then forget about going back to the supermarket because it just puts a flag up saying, I'm here and I'm vulnerable, etc. To the roving gangs that no doubt will come up. Because you don't need a freezer to put the Lee Enfield 303 rifle rounds in type thing. And then, of course, he goes on, oh, I've now got to make a knife from scratch. So let me go find some iron ore, dig a hole, get some iron ore, etc. And then he shows you the knife he made. Yeah, and then he shows you a knife that he made, and it's absolute crap. It won't take an edge.
You can do it.
Yeah, it might take you 300 or 400 goes to get as good as that. But did you dig up the iron ore in the first instance?
No, I used a truck spring.
After you used up all the truck springs, what
It's
you
going to
did?
take millennia to use up all the truck springs.
Yeah,
I mean, okay, here's the best example for that right there. I mean, they were continuing to use fragments of the Colosseum as construction materials, I think, until,
1960.
1,500 years, 1,600 years after it was built. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The people, reusing, again, it's just, it's yeah. Anyway,
Right.
we'll always be recycling stuff from before.
Right. Well, and since you brought up the Colosseum and the Romans, I was thinking more this week about this whole numbering system that Morris is using. Because I was reminded that that the Romans were in the low 30s according to his scale of mostly, I don't know, the calories that they were accessing per capita or something like that. What about that whole thing? I mean, we kind of talked around his sort of his systematization of these ideas last time around, but we didn't really kind of head on talk about that. So what about that?
I was about to bring that up too.
It does. Continue then.
I think he even says that others have come up with other systems, but they tend to correlate or come up with a similar. I mean, it's like, well, I have to have something I can use consistently. That's kind of his rationale. But then he justifies it at some point by saying other systems seem to come up with similar, whatever. It's almost like you got to have something that'll work over time. So here's what I've got.
Right, which is fair, and I guess I kind of believe him when he says, okay, I tried adding, a couple more factors to this, and it didn't render the results that much different, so I opted for the, kind of the simpler take. I think he said that with respect to urbanization, right? He just said, well, I'm just going to
that same logic.
Who's got the biggest city,
He used that same logic to apply to lots of things. Like, well, this has happened because there's lots of shipwrecks from this time period or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
There's got to be something that he can make a connection with an abstraction of, I don't know, whatever, some abstraction related to progress. And or if progress happens, then this kind of thing should have happened. So,
Yeah.
There's a core thing, a core statistical thing of like, it doesn't really matter so much what number is. I mean, when I'm looking at like analytics and stuff, for marketing or whatever, it doesn't so much matter what the number is. It's more interesting to see how that number changes, not what the number necessarily is representing. So,
Right.
And would people actually disagree? Do we feel like, whether or not it's, it's 30 or whatever, would we actually disagree? Do you think people disagree with his general idea, if you take the numbers out of it, of, okay, Western civilization didn't really reach the level of development that it had in the Roman period until the Renaissance or something like that. Is that fair anyway? I mean, whether or not he's using a number.
But also you've got the problem of, if you take a look at enough randomized numbers, you'll start to see straight lines no matter what it happens to be. And oddly enough, there's a mathematician called Hannah Fry in the UK. She recently did a critique of things like ley line scenes. We talked about von Draken being sort of a start of, let's take some correlations that just happen not to have any causation type thing. And it turns out that Hannah found that guy called, I forgot what his surname is, Matt something, I forget the surname, wanted to disprove ley lines. So he said, I'm going to pick another ancient type monument, plot them all out and find the straight lines. And the ancient monument he took was all of the UK branches of a shop called Woolworths that had closed down in the sort of 2010 or something.
Yeah.
And very quickly he found a 200+ mile long straight line, the middle of which was also the start of a small perfect triangle. That was also the centre of a star that echoed the ley lines in and around Somerset, but somebody said, oh, look, there's a perfect pentacle there. But such that, do we really think that the board of Woolworths were putting their branches down to exactly where various geometric plots would make perfect ley lines? No, we don't. But
I disagree. It's the lizard people. They controlled secretly Woolworths. I mean, are you blind, man?
Right.
Well, the thing that comes off of this is, once the UK Woolworths all closed down, they were still open in the Middle East out of the Australian branch. Oddly enough, when the shops weren't quite the same. But the thing, going back to Boris's thing, the thing that I thought outside of the urbanisation number that needs to be tracked, a bit rather like I've mentioned back a few times, there's a book by what's his name Hesketh, about where he's trying to track prices over historical periods, such that, because coinage is such a bad thing, he's trying to make it, I've now got the cost of going to war but in the currency called pints of beer or loaves of bread, because those things ultimately are constant given your level of technology increasing, etc. But I thought two things. There was the quote from Monty Python about what has Roman never given us, which I thought was quite good.
Peace.
And again, as a useful reason. But the piece I just put in a few minutes ago about Egyptian records show Roman era farmers could harvest 10 pounds of wheat for every pound of wheat going in. So what's the current number? And what's the number in different regions? You know, Ukraine, how much better or worse is that to the Midwest versus the Corn Belt in Canada?
Mhm.
And what's the inputs given from technology of those bits? And then you then turn it round the other way and say, how could you do that in a collapse situation? And there's an Israeli guy, Perlman, Pelman.
Mhm.
He's an academic, and he goes to work as an academic. But he doesn't go to the supermarket for any of his food. He grows all of his own food on his own. And so one of the big things that he's piped up with, takes him 8 hours, average over the year, takes him 8 hours a month to do everything associated with feeding himself for a year. The one thing that's missing is he doesn't make his own salt. He's got to go buy water, and
Water would seem to be a big factor.
there's one other. Yeah, he's in the Galilean Valley, so water's a problem anyway. And there's something else, I forget what it is. It's spicy something, pepper and spicy.
Mhm.
So he divides his land into three, and he goes round a circle. And 1/3 is down to fava beans, 1/3 is down to wheat, and 1/3 is down to vegetables. But the vegetables are in 5 further divisions. And for each working month, because you can't work in the summer, and it's too much water cost to grow watermelons in sort of Galilee Valley in Israel in the summer. He just stops growing and just lets it go fallow. So that's another bad use of the average 8 hours a month. But he borrows a tractor for about 4 days a year, and he's got a threshing machine that allows him to winnow and thresh and winnow in one go. But otherwise, it's just him. And the only other thing that he's got is he's got like 10 or 12 olive trees already there, and he community expresses the oil.
Mhm.
It's not clear what happens to the mush afterward, whether that comes back. But so he's got the oil, some element of protein and cooking. He's got his beans, which gives him protein. He's got his wheat that gives him carbohydrate. And then all the vegetables for the sugar and the protein and vitamins, etc. And he grows fresh veg for like 8 months. That's it. The downside is it's very undiverse, except it's not really clear on how diverse his vegetables are.
Mhm.
So if we all did that and we all lived next door but two to each other, provided we haven't got the same variety of fava beans, and provided we've got different varieties of cabbage and tomatoes in our veg patch,
Mhm.
and watermelon or those type thing, we've got a diversity within the community. We've got a simple, and part of why he manages to do 8 hours, I think, a lot of it is the simplicity of the system. He's got one sowing of the fava beans, one harvest of the wheat, one threshing,
Mhm.
etc., etc. Job done. And he's now got a year plus worth of wheat in jars all the way around his kitchen.
Mhm.
I think.
Well,
So-
again, the question, the unanswered question in that whole thing is, for how many people, right? So I mean, and Morris himself
one
was
person.
right. Morris
The more-
Morris himself was talking about okay, you could shake, these wheat you could shake this weed and and enough grain would fall off it, to feed your hunter gatherer. At the beginning, as he's telling the story of how he imagined hunter gatherers became, they're at before they even became farmers, their populations started to expand, and that's the thing that's always kind of left out of the stories is you can compare sort of the effectiveness and the efficacy and the work involved and all of that of these of different different techniques, different hunting and gathering in places. I mean, and Graeber talked about this when he was talking about Poverty Point, hugely rich, kind of an environment in in the Mississippi Delta kind of region, that just provided so much, but again, depending on the size of the population that you were trying to feed.
And the better fed you are, the more food there is, easy food there is, the bigger the population grows radically, and that's the whole point of, it's really easy if the population stays absolutely steady, but it doesn't stay absolutely steady because as you eat more, you have more kids. That's just sort of how it works. And then of course we got this whole other issue, where that caloric input thing that our guy here talks about, I mean, it includes how many calories went into creating that threshing machine, for instance.
Right.
That's a big old, that's a massive caloric input.
Right.
How many, or just the glass jars that this guy's, guys canning his stuff with. It's that caloric input is huge, and those are inputs this guy is having to put a lot of time and effort into. So I don't know.
Yeah,
but I like the whole, that one I really liked, actually. He's of the three pillars of his thing, and I forget what the third one was. We've got size of city, we've got the caloric input. Now, what was the third one?
What was the third
one? Urbanization, caloric inputs or caloric usage, and there's a third one that was it didn't, right. If it mattered that much, we would remember it. I don't know.
Let's see if I can find out. Third.
We'd have to. Yeah, because he had that in the early chapters, there was a bunch of math that I was just like, no, I'm not interested.
Third trait, per capita wealth. And then the fourth is, we should wait a minute. Third traits must be independent of each other. Is this the thing? No, this is different. This is a different list of things. I don't know.
It was chapter 3, if I remember, like page 1-ish.
But also at the same point, you've got the Hans-Rosling bubble diagram of the other measure is child mortality, the survivability of the mother, and the general number for what's the age of death, the average age of death. So, when do we go from 25, 35 up to an average of 50, and then up to an average is now sitting around 70 plus? And the other one, I call the kid mortality came up again in, I think, chapter 6 or 7. At a point within that chapter, they were talking of 1 in 5. Was it 1 in 5 children didn't get to the age of 5? There was the alliteration of a number somewhere along the line. And I was just thinking on that, for a family reason, I've just had to bury my youngest nephew. And so he's 36. And three teenage daughters. He's the first person of my kids' generation that I know about that has died outside of a simple accident. And I was thinking, when was the first person that I went to school with that I know died? And he was like, he was 50, 52, 53 from memory, and he died of cancer. But my great aunts had 6 kids. 2 died before they were 5. And then my great aunt was predeceased by her youngest at about 50 something from cancer.
Mhm.
So the more you push down on nobody's really dying from flu and nobody's really dying from chicken pox and all those diseases that are dealt with by the Hans Rosling bubble type diagram stuff, it means that at least 2 of us are probably going to die from Ebola because we've got no resistance. It's the only resistance we have in that context, or the only reason we haven't got resistance, is it's never really bubbled out of sort of Central West Africa.
Mhm.
As soon as it does, we've got a major problem. Right? Because I would like to think the 6 of us would wear a mask, but we could probably go to another chat room somewhere where we would be wildly outnumbered by those people who wouldn't wear a mask. Because
or mask or not even. I mean, I don't know whether or not Ebola. I mean, I just don't know this about Ebola, for instance, because that's a whole family of things, right? You know, whether or not having survived it, whether or not having survived it once, you actually get significant increased resistance. I mean, even with COVID, it looks like having survived it doesn't necessarily. It gives you slightly increased resistance. You have to keep that. If you want to keep resistance going, you got to keep getting vaccinated against the new versions. Kind of like with the common cold. So I don't know.
Well, what struck me as odd this week too, in thinking about his social development line, is we now have a reasonable numeric model for, let's say, a president says, "I'm going to bomb Iran back to the Dark Ages."
Oh, whatever.
We have a number for what that looks like now, and I think it's um,
And the
you
amount
know,
of energy it would take to
and
achieve.
alternately taking that same thought with burying a Chinese emperor with 1,000 of his followers at his death just sounds like a great idea. So I think we should take that Kennedy memorial and leave his name on it. And in 6 months when he's gone, like everybody goes with him. And we just bury them all with, all the 6,000
Under
soldiers.
the reflecting pool.
Disclaimer.
That aside, I think one of the missing things that I really would have appreciated him including as he's retelling this history, and I think it's roughly like chapter 5 through chapter 6, he kind of like goes through most of history and lays it out with these graphs in close up, is if he had gone back and said, okay, from from this period to this period, we jump up 20%.
Yeah.
And the 20% could be potentially attributed to these 3 innovations or these couple of agricultural changes or technological changes, or let's say you could do a comparative, because comparative anthropology is fun.
Mhm.
What does Europe look like during the Black Plague? And how much does society drop on this social development index compared with what does North American Indian society look like when the Europeans invade and disease and war decimates 3/4 or more of their population? And what does that drop look like? So you can compare those things to see which one is the more dramatic drop in social index.
Right.
Well,
I think that
that's like a missing opportunity that he could have thrown in here that would have helped make clear these numbers and how he's using them to compare societies, and he
does
doesn't do it.
He
Well,
does talk somewhat about the horsemen. He's, the horsemen. And interestingly, one of the big horsemen is actual horsemen, right? It's both for the East and the West. It's the Turks or some variety of the Turks. They come in,
the tatters.
destroy, loot, destroy, loot, break, whatever you want to call a sort of Turks, Turkish people, but the steppe dwellers, they come in either to China or to the West and wreak havoc, make a huge, and that's exactly one of the main things that typically is like, okay, back down again, and that just keeps going until
Well, what that's
basically
the comparison though is a little bit frustrating to me. But first, I want to say to go back to what Chris was saying, that that we jump up by 20% in maybe in both of these places. So, and one of the questions that I've sort of had that sort of was in my mind last week, and I maybe didn't express it, but has been sort of increasing is, maybe the issue of these increases and decreases is more relevant, more important than who ends up a little bit ahead at the end. If both places increase 20% or 25%, or both of them double their ability to use energy, or the per capita calories, or whatever measurement you want to use, is it as relevant which one is ahead at the end of that process as the fact that they, that both of them increased, or that both of them decreased, or that one of them increased and one of them decreased? I mean, it seems like maybe these changes are more, kind of maybe more meaningful than, who is, whose line is above the others at any, kind of particular given point. He, and as an example of that, he, there's a point where he's talking about the bubonic plague, the Black Death, and he says there's no good time for something like the Black Death to visit humanity, but it's hard to think of a worse time than the 1340s. Well, okay, and the point that he's making is that this is the end of the medieval warm period and the beginning of, the Little Ice Age, and that would seem to be relevant to different places in very different ways. If you're, a Norseman living on Greenland, it's extremely relevant, right? It's the end of your 500-year settlement. Not only that, but your contact with Iceland and your contact with Vinland, and the North Sea is going to be littered with icebergs that you can't easily navigate around, and so that seems to be a whole lot different, and I don't think he goes into enough real analysis of, okay, so what happens to, the monsoon patterns in Asia, during this period, and what effect does that really have?
talk somewhat about this, and again, specifically the climate thing of, and that was one of the real advantages that the East has in dealing with that, is because you had a relatively combined economy that they could balance it out a little bit better. That they could, the internal migration was a little easier to deal with, whereas the West during the same period is having sort of these violent internecine wars, and there is no empire during that period. There is no empire, particularly in the West. There's everybody fighting each other for these resources, so you don't have as much of that being able to deal with, okay, yeah, it got cold someplace else, so now you're going to grow something different, and it's got hot in someplace else, we're going to grow a little different. So he does get into it some, but I don't.
Yeah, but
Some.
the whole, and again, it's sort of like geography, right? Is the thing,
Yeah.
right? So in
Yeah.
in the West, you've got these, you've got oceans that you have to deal with, and you've got mountain ranges that you have to deal with, and you've got the Mediterranean, and and all of these things, and and in the East, you've got, once you've got the Grand Canal, okay, well that creates an opportunity, he says, like the Mediterranean, to move, to move a lot of goods around and to feed the North with the rice harvests of the South. One of the things that I did actually kind of rather like was when he says Islam is the West. That Islam becomes kind of the West, with Christendom being kind of this little northern fringe or frosting on the big cake of Western Islam, and that's a thing that we don't normally want to admit or credit.
I mean, we wouldn't have modern math, or we wouldn't have the history of ancient. We wouldn't have Greek. We wouldn't have sort of the ancient Greek philosophy available to us.
Right.
We wouldn't,
right. But the thing that we need to sort of also though credit is that Islam extends into the East, right? Islam extends to Asia, through the Ottoman Empire into the Safavid, and then into the Mughal, and so where and into the Indonesia, right, and Malaysia, and all of these places that by 1100, 1200, Islam is
just blame the Turks.
I'm sorry.
Just blame the Turks again. I mean, if you go to Istanbul, you can see just how badly they build mosques, as in the Blue Mosque. It's what you've got to remember is Saint Sophia, which Hagia Sophia, it's now back as a mosque.
The world's
is, if I remember right, is like 350, 360 AD.
Yeah.
The Blue Mosque is the first mosque they build after they take Istanbul at 1455 build site. It's fallen down. It's only like a mile apart, right? So it's fallen
but the Dome
down.
of the Rock has withstood the time. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is arguably the first mosque that they built, and it's still there.
Yeah, but it's not designed as though it's a Roman Catholic church, which they copied to make the Blue Mosque. So when you think of a very shallow dome and the minarets and all the rest of the classic Turkish style, rather than a mogul or an onion type dome, it's because they're copying the Eastern Roman design from the Hagia Sophia.
And it took them some time to get it right. I would agree.
Well, but the Blue Mosque has fallen down more times since 1450 than the Hagia Sophia has from 350. So it's an extra 1100 years, right? And it's also quicker to repair, apparently.
Well, I mean, you got to give the Romans credit for knowing how to make concrete domes.
Absolutely. I mean, you've only got to look at the Parthenon and see just how badly Agrippa did with his concrete.
If I recall, it's taken anthropologists until the last 2 or 3 years to figure out what the element was in some of the Roman concretes that actually made them as good as they were, because we hadn't been able as a culture to technologically recreate their awesome concrete in modern day.
The thing that I thought,
clearly aliens,
and has been trying to butt in with ever since Chris talked about his mechanism for the lights went off in Iran because of the war, is the Day Mirror in the other song, when the lights come on again all across the world, right? I don't think the lights really ever went out in Tehran, given the current bombing regime. They certainly didn't go out in Dubai in spite of the current bombing regime.
But there was an awful lot of, huge fuel shortages and everything in East Asia, in places that, not so much the bombing, but the closure of the strait.
Yeah, but in terms of things like when the lights come on again type thing, I think Berlin had a bigger problem in 45 than even Singapore or Jakarta or Hong Kong or whatever had as a fuel is. But it's if we've now got a new current deal to stop the Iranians getting nuclear warheads, then we haven't got a 1945-46 solution. We've got a skirmish solution of you'll put your guns down while we walk across the water and fix a few things. So, yeah, but as a measure of success, given that it's not successful, then I think that the burial needs to be earlier than later. Really, somebody should go up and just start that clock immediately. Really, don't think we need to wait for it to happen naturally. Please, soon. But
The energy part. I mean, back to the energy part. I mean, we also have, and this has not come out yet, the massive increases in, the food issues are going to, because the massive increase in fertilizer, costs, the massive shortage in fertilizer costs.
Mhm.
That's something that's got a very long lead time. That, again, that affects the United States, even though we're theoretically, I mean, again, I got my, I got a bunch of relatives who own a farm, who own a large farm. And 75% increase in fertilizer price means a lot of farmers, American farmers, who's theoretically, insulated, saying, we're not going to plant this here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's worldwide. Yeah. It's like, we just can't afford it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's a sort of, to go back into history with food, that's a sort of a thing that, when we get to, so we've got this Zhang He, sort of counterfactual in Mexico, and then we get, and then he goes on to, Prince Henry the Navigator, and and the Portuguese, and the thing about, and of course the Portuguese, of course, as they go down the western side and then go around to the eastern side of Africa, and they start, Angola and Mozambique, and they begin, transporting a lot of Africans out of the Congo Kingdom. This could have been, a population, and the way that we normally talk about it is we normally say, like 16 million Africans were transported, and about 4 million of them died on the trip, and another 12 million, made it to the Caribbean and the New World, and and were enslaved, and probably, and the majority of them, worked to death in 2 or 3 years, and this could have been a huge population disaster for Africa, except that apparently, and primarily because of the Columbian Exchange, and because of the transportation of food, of staple products like corn, and especially cassava, into Africa, the net population of Africa during the period of the Atlantic slave trade actually increased.
Wow.
Which is not to say that, which is not to say anything about, about the tragedy and the crime involved, and it's not to say anything about, about what Africa might have been able to achieve had, 16 million of its young people not been ripped out of their homes into the Atlantic trade. But it's an interesting, thing to think about, that the population disaster could have been much worse had it not been for this transfer of food products.
There's another counterfactual that he does not get into at all, which is interesting, is why were the Americas so ripe for the taking? There were highly organized civilizations in, particularly the Incas, the Aztecs slightly less so.
Mhm.
Very highly organized civilizations. They fed each other just great. Fed themselves just great.
Right.
Why were they so ripe for the take? Even without the diseases. Why? What happened there is something that's interesting.
Well, I don't think that there is that it's even possible to imagine without the diseases, right?
Well, good point. Good point.
Because
Good point.
I mean, and that would be my, I mean, that's all sort of always my, my kind of go-to is, sort of Alfred Crosby, and that it's not, that it's not guns, germs, and steel. It's germs, 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 and a little bit of horses, guns, and dogs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, part of that, the guns, germs, and steel argument, though, is the geographical building up that allowed them, a couple thousand years of additional technological advancement before they show up to give them, things like horses and guns. An organizational military warfare strategy are pieces of it. In fact, I can't help but think about C.P. Snow's two cultures thesis, which kind of broadly boils down to people in the sciences usually have some knowledge of the humanities and can work in both spheres, but a lot of people in the humanities have no idea about kind of medium level physics or even things like statistical mechanics.
Mhm.
And I can't help but wonder too, because you can look at the complexity of how these civilizations are growing, which Morris kind of takes in. I think it was Eric that put the third trait of information flow, and it kind of relates to what Cesar Hidalgo's thesis was in his book about how the culture and the connections between the people help to lift everything up from an economic and complexity standpoint. And we don't, or at least I'm not seeing a lot of that like laid out here in Morris's book because I think I don't know that he has that scientific background to really be able to drag it into the argument. But it would be a fascinating thing to look at as the complexity of all these societies moving up and down and what's causing them to move up and down
Mhm.
as kind of there's a statistical thermodynamic thing playing out in all of these societies that's making technology booms in one place versus another. If you think about um, what does it take within a society to create an Einstein?
Mhm.
How unlikely is it that a specific society is going to be able to produce somebody who's smart like an Einstein who can make a massive breakthrough given the resources he's got around him that jumps your state of the art in physics from here to way up here? And or what would this last century look like if you simply removed Claude Shannon and Albert Einstein from the early 1900s? This last
Somebody else
century
would
was
have come up with
dramatically different.
somebody else would have come up with again.
Somebody
Would
else
have come up
may have,
Yeah.
but you take the statistical thermodynamics and you remove those two pieces, a huge amount of modern society would not exist without those two people. And or the people who came after them that used their ideas to, because literally Claude Shannon invented all of modern digital communication. All of it comes out of his paper in at the end of the 1930s. And
But
without it, we don't have computers on our
Shannon,
desk. We aren't on Zoom right now.
Shannon and Einstein both were again standing on the shoulders of giants too. I mean, we've got this ongoing. Yeah. Einstein could never have come up with general relativity without thousands and thousands of years before of ongoing developments that happened up to and including during his lifetime.
Mhm.
So I mean, yeah, it's a development thing. But anyway, I mean, we do, and he does. But getting back to the part, another part you were talking about, sort of the cultural exchange stuff. It's interesting how technological exchange. Like I mean, we do get into this a little bit here with how the East has wrought, cast iron and, paper and gunpowder hundreds of years beforehand. And somehow or other,
And
they basically
Damascus
invent
steel.
guns. Yeah, they invent guns
Mhm.
for all intents and purposes,
Yep.
and then 300 years later, 400 years later, the Westerners come with guns that are based on, everything about them is based on stuff that the Chinese, the Eastern actually did.
Yep.
And are overwhelmed by Eastern, by Westerners using technology that they had for themselves for hundreds of years before it even got to the West.
Right.
So 1,000 years of access to this stuff.
And he does mention at one point, that when I think he's talking about the things that Marco Polo is observing and writing about, right? And he says that, okay, so they've got this, they've got coal, they've got this black, this rock that burns, and then he says, but Polo is equally impressed by other things, and it's part of this big tapestry of the culture, and it's not a point of focus in the way that it is, that it will become for the British and lead to the Age of Steam and all of that. One of the things, and I thought that was kind of interesting, one of the things that sort of interested me a lot was this idea, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about the Americas and about the Incas, being really at a kind of a high point of civilization and of organization, and kind of the Roman Empire of the Americas, right, with the roads and everything. Yeah. And we don't know that much about it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't, that there wasn't a lot going on, right? This whole idea, of, and then of course the fact that disease is able to wipe out 90% of them, and in places where the white man hadn't yet been, right? I mean, by the time that Pizarro crosses the Andes with 60 men and 40 horses and a bunch of pigs in 1532, the Inca polity has already been, it's already in the middle of a civil war, because Huayna Capac had died in 1528, and then, along with his favorite son and heir in Cusco, and then his two sons are duking it out for control of the empire. And that's based on the trade routes, right? And so that is, that's kind of a really interesting thing to me, right? So this idea of Einstein and, that Chris was bringing up, and the cultural exchange and the zeitgeist that contributes to, maybe to some extent to, to the things that he was able to do. What kind of zeitgeist was there in the Americas that we don't even know about, right? That was enabled by the fact that they had this, this multi-continent trade route, trade network that kept people in contact, culturally in contact, to some extent that we don't really understand, because of course, the Inca didn't have any written records, and the written records that the Maya and the Aztec had were all burned by Jesuits. So it's a mystery, but it's interesting, it's another interesting thing to kind of speculate about.
Yeah, I mean, I've read about a third or a halfway through the Incas, the book by the guy who who's the daughter of one of the son of a conquistador and an Incan princess. And it does talk a lot. And I got tired after there gets to be lots of, and he won another battle, and he won this massive history of the Incan Empire pre-Columbian Incan Empire.
Mm-hmm.
But he does talk a lot about, there obviously, this empire that was built, there was an awful lot of, people didn't want to be part of the empire. They wanted to have their own. So there's already a lot of, zeitgeist of in internal stuff,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Of unhappiness with the central. So maybe, it was breaking. It was going to break up anyway, just like any empire eventually, has divisions.
Well, and apparently the Huayna Capac, the final major ruler
Yeah.
who sort of consolidated the four regions, he got down to about the latitude of Santiago in Chile, and he wasn't able really to go beyond there because of the Mapuche, who were still down there. Right, and who the Spanish were not able to conquer, and who the nation of Chile has never been able to conquer, and who are still, there's still about 600,000 of them living in southern Chile and Patagonian Argentina, who managed to hold out. So yeah, so that's interesting. One of the things that also kind of struck me was just sort of that there's a moment for things, right? So when he going back to your information technology, Eric, when he talks about Chinese artisans first made paper from mulberry bark in 105, and wood pulp paper was common by 700s, and then the Arabs learned about it in 750, and the Italians started buying it after 1150 and making their own by 1276. And this, of course, is the Zibaldone story, right? That whole notebook thing, and so the
I love that part because this last week I actually spent about 3 hours researching mulberry paper making techniques because
cool.
I want to go back and I want to remake. No one manufactures it anymore, but there is a special type of stencil paper that used to be used for typewriters to make stencils, to make like copies with spirit duplicators and
Mm,
like ditto machines,
hmm.
and no one makes it anymore. I can't find it. So I literally spent 3 hours digging into how to do this myself so I
Wow.
can make this paper now. So when I read this, I was like, wow, this is a nice long history of all this technology that in the modern digital age is incredibly hard to dig up and research and find out how to do any of these techniques now
Hmm.
in your backyard or in your garage. And I'm like, this should be way easier
Yeah.
given how much influence this particular paper making technique has had for 1,000+ years.
Hmm.
And I was like,
2000.
it's sad that I can't recreate it in less than an hour, or even find a really good resource that says, here's how you do it.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't easily exist, or it doesn't exist easily on the internet.
Hmm.
So,
I probably could drive over to UCLA and find a book that does all of it, but you know, it's
I mean,
not
so
on the internet yet.
yeah, so two, excuse me, two thoughts from that occur. One, I'm curious what part of the mulberry is used, and I guess I can probably, if you've posted about this, I'll go there. But the second thought is, your question reminds me of the Foxfire series and the goal of capturing, lost Appalachian
Hmm.
folkways and arts.
Hmm.
Mhm.
But I
Well,
think
and
that's all
that, it's kind of
physical
funny.
also.
I had to have my bike. I had to have a new tires
Attire, yeah.
put on my bike because of a flat that I had this week. So I took it over to a bike shop, and and I thought about it, and I thought, I used to do all my own, bike repairs
Yeah,
from.
putting a tire on is easy.
Yeah, well, and you know, and
Or should be.
and putting, and changing chains and rings and and all kinds of things, and I don't, and I was thinking about all the, and that sort of got me thinking because, yeah, there used to be Foxfire, and there used to, there even for a while there in the digital era, right? There was this hope, I guess, maybe it was just a hope that there would become this culture of makers, right? And that people would, that people would kind of get into, you know, all this do-it-yourself stuff, and of course, Cory Doctorow and Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer, went crazy with it and predicted a bunch of things that never happened, right? And the right to repair was a huge, and extinguishing that, with kill switches and you know and putting chips in toner cartridges and shit like that, you know, was the counter move
Yeah.
that, you know, that the
I'll have
industry
to
made to that.
I'll have to dig it up, but there's somebody who keeps track of catalogs and things that are manufactured still in the modern age that go back 100 or 150 years, you know, agricultural implements that you would use or maybe want even in the third world,
Hmm.
because you're not going to buy a modern John Deere tractor, but you can still find a catalog that will sell you, you know, an old school plow of the sort that would have been used in the 1600s, let's say.
Right. Or instead you're not gonna buy a modern one, but you're gonna repair a farmall from the 40s.
Yeah.
Or hell, even
Or
from
or a John
the
Deere from the
70s.
Yeah.
Yeah, John Deere from the 70s or 80s
Yeah.
is still very repairable.
Right.
I mean, yeah, I used to work on cars and motorcycles. I would not have a, you know, I could change a tire
Hmm.
on a modern vehicle,
Yep.
but you know, I mean, I did engine swaps and engine repair on stuff, you know, that was built in the 80s with no problem. It was tools.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of funny because you know, when I think back on my own life, I mean, I like took apart the carburetor of my moped and you know and put it back together and it worked. It's like you know you know and my kids, you know, my daughter, you know, my youngest daughter who's 18, 19 had asked her, and I didn't get around to doing it, and I hope maybe someday we'll have an opportunity again. But you know, as she was sort of already out of the house and you know and leaving everything. She said, "God, I wish you know I wish you would teach me how to you know how to make things out of wood, right? Because I had a bunch of you know tools and I had built." You know, all kinds of things around the hobby farm, and I built them this sort of elaborate tree house and stuff, and yeah, and it's just and it's sort of like and I don't really I guess long time to get to this point that I'm trying to make, I guess that there was you know there was a culture of you know just sort of messing with stuff and figuring it out
Yeah.
in the
Or even a
physical.
tradition of writing it down so that you can pass it on, or so that it could skip a generation who didn't get it passed down to them,
Mhm.
who
Yeah,
can pull it out. So there are a bunch of old school typewriter guys in their 70s and 80s who are dying now,
yeah, yeah.
who apprenticed and learned a trade and a craft, and it's not
Hmm.
been passed down. And you can, through a lot of work by a bunch of people over the last decade, I know a bunch of people who found old repair manuals and details. And you know, there's one guy who's put a ton of stuff on YouTube of how he repaired specific things
Yeah,
so that you can watch those and do those repairs on your own.
right,
But the
right.
amount of time you have to spend to first find the resources and then watch them and consume them and then do those things is a, you know, almost two magnitudes of order in terms of time for how to, you know, buy a $20 piece of junk typewriter
Yeah.
and make it a $1,000 workable machine to sit on your desk
Hmm.
is
there,
it's huge.
there's also an important difference in that as much as I loved working on cars and motorcycles. So last time I was in the Midwest recently again, and I rented a car. I rented a brand new car. It was a cheap car, and it was significantly faster, quieter, more comfortable, and vastly safer and more fuel efficient than the last car I owned, which was a Porsche 911.
Okay.
It was a 1990, it was 1985 Porsche 911 that cost I mean, it was I loved that car. It was so much fun.
Hmm.
And yeah, I don't remember what brand this generic rental car was,
Hmm.
but you know, it was a better car, you know,
Yeah.
and you know, and yeah, it's just you know, again, I enjoyed, you know, I would enjoy as a nostalgia to, I enjoyed working on the car almost as much as I enjoyed, you know, driving it back when I had it. 20 years ago.
Mhm.
But yeah,
No Tin Lizzy in the garage right now?
I don't have a garage. I'm in Manhattan, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't owned I haven't owned a car in 20 years.
What's a car?
It's kind of
Exactly.
funny. I remember when I sort of migrated. I bounced around a lot in my undergraduate years, which lasted from like 1980 to 1983, and then I quit school and had to go back later. But along the way, as I was sort of transitioning from plant and animal science, a potential double major, to agricultural economics, one of the intro ag economics courses that I took was on small farms, and it was with this guy who I actually ended up being my advisor, and I worked on his little farm up in the hills, and one of the books that he had us buy was it was a USDA annual. So the USDA used to put out an annual book each year on a different topic. And the one for, I don't know, the late 70s or 1980-ish or sometime was called Living on a Few Acres. And it was a bunch of things it was sort of an anthology of a bunch of ways that you could kind of make a little bit of a living, doing different things on a small acreage, like raising Christmas trees or this and that, or heifers for dairy replacements or, whatever. And it was kind of weird because it was sort of like, you could go out into the sticks and, just, walk down a dirt road and meet people who knew this kind of stuff and could teach you this kind of stuff. But, the USDA had to like write a book and publish it out there as an ag, as an ag annual in order to kind of, partially to signal that that this is an area of interest, but also to sort of revive or sort of popularize these ideas that were that had been common knowledge to to other people previously. Similarly, when I first got interested in raising chickens, when I moved up to northern Minnesota, I started the year or two before that sort of preparing and reading books about that, and one of the ones, and there was a stories guide to to poultry that was very, very basic and very very much out of ag extension kind of publications and stuff. But then there was this guy Harvey Ussery who was a hippie, and sort of this kind of weird Buddhist hippie guy with a lot of ideas, and he wrote this very elaborate and kind of evocative book about raising a small poultry flock, and he did introduce some ideas that were not in the stories guide, like using deep bedding instead of just keeping the place clean and having concrete floors and all that kind of stuff. But again, sort of this idea that okay, we're going to take sort of what had been for a previous generation of kind of like obvious common knowledge, and we're going to I guess maybe celebrate it or imbue it with some type of some level of importance that would have been surprised. I guess it wasn't out of place, but would have been surprising to the people who just knew how to raise chickens and had always raised chickens, and their mothers and grandmothers had raised chickens through the Depression and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, make agriculture great again, and it leads to sort of partially it leads to kind of the the permaculture-y, renewable agriculture stuff that Tim is interested in, has been talking about too.
Right.
But yeah.
I mean, the one thing I was thinking about when Will was talking about his 9/11, there was two sides of the same coin to a certain extent. One was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that has virtually nothing about a spanner in it except have a spanner. And make sure you know how to use the spanner and don't use it as a hammer.
Right.
And then of course,
and I'm not going to tell you how, because it's obvious.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the thing that the initial reaction was this whole story about the 9/11 was good fun to play with, good fun to drive, and I knew I was in a Porsche and a 911. It's just a glorified Volkswagen.
I had the Volkswagen. I didn't have Zen. I had the Volkswagen book for my
versus this totally unforgettable but safer, more comfortable, more efficient, more effective driving device is how is it you didn't read In Search of Excellence in spite of all the fairy tales that are in which they then confessed were fairy tales 15, 20 years later. But the number of people that know how to fix a car or fix anything almost versus now it's just it doesn't work, so I'm going to swap the chip or whatever, right? I had my bathroom light go this week and I'm sitting there thinking, where is it? Is the whole thing that sits on the flat ceiling, or is it the dome, the glass dome, which I couldn't get to shift? Turns out it's the whole thing. And because it's an LED thing, it's also got a choice of daylight, white light, and just general light. So although it had gone, the guy that came to change it held on to the new one, took the cover off, flipped the switch, put the cover back. So I now got a daylight light as opposed to a walk light in the bathroom. So the joke is my dick pictures will now look different. But it's the same light, it's the same fitting. And when in that moment where it was taken off, you can't change the bulb because there is no at bulb. There are 3 strips of LED. And it's like, I go back to a few years back when I first went out to Dubai, and I end up with a building complex where I've got the CEO phoning me up, or the COO rather, phoning me up saying, there's a light out, puts the phone down. And it's like, yeah, I know there's a light out because there's 1.3 fucking million of them. Which one did you notice? Right? And it's a phone call to security. Where did Fred walk from his office back to his apartment? So I need to go back and walk that route, send somebody to walk that route, go find the light that's out. And it's like, you know, I know there's a light out. I guarantee there's one out. But, you know, and the ability, and that's partly why I raised this Israeli guy, got his name again already, but he grows his own wheat and fava beans as being, that's effectively 9/10 of the work he does to get his food. It's simple, doable, and controllable at the one person point. Not, I mean, there's one of the people you might find from the UK. There's a guy called Chris Platt. He's somewhere on the funny spectrum with a certain amount of autism, but he's become quite famous as a TV presenter of wildlife programming. And from that, he's evolved into a really big activist for energy and ecology and stuff. And he put out a meme once of, why do I need a pear in March? And the pear in March came in a pre-peeled pear in a plastic container that was an Argentinian pear that was then peeled and put in a piece of plastic in Thailand and then shipped to UK. Why don't I just wait until August for a pear? You know, the immediacy and the actual tangibility of something. And that came out about the same time as the Fannie financial collapse and stuff. Things have just got too complicated. Nobody actually really knows how it works from end to end. And that brings of course, back into Lewis Dartnell's book of I've got a pencil with a metal band and an eraser on the end. Now go away and make me one from scratch. You might, to start with, be able to do like you did with your knife, go buy some or find a bit of scrap metal, make yourself a knife. And yes, well done. But it's the same problem that he says at some point, all of the stuff that's in the grocery store or the supermarket will be out of limit, out of safety. What do you do next? How do you get your pink Himalayan salt when you're stuck in California next, when there's no transport? And more importantly, why has it only got a 3.5 month life, safe usage time life on it, when the advertising for it on the same label says it's 2.9 million years old already?
Well, to be honest, California is getting rid of the best by dates on food now. By law. It's a weird thing that's becoming a law, I think on July 1st. That's not a thing anymore. So we fix that. Or it's about to be fixed.
Well, but then you cheated. I mean, I'm more interested at the moment is, do you guys recognise that your stocks of Zyklon B are now out of date and therefore no use anymore?
Yeah. Well, the one thing he brings up, and I don't think he does really great job at super concrete examples, but he talks about, the core and the fringe, or areas that are outside that, and it's almost a gardening metaphor where you trim back your plant so it can grow back bigger and better. Although he doesn't use that really as his analogy, but I think that's what he's talking about in some of these areas where the core has a great technology and then things collapse a little bit, the social development index goes down, but then areas on the fringe are able to take advantage of that, which if you, and he doesn't, I wish he'd have made it more explicit, but if you watch his story in chapter 5 and chapter 6, the core moves from Mesopotamia up and around, it moves over to Egypt, it expands, then the Roman Empire it moves up into Italy and then expands from there again, and then it moves to Europe and expands again. So there's always contracting, expanding, but the core of the space he's talking about as the West, at least, and even the same analogy could be done in China because China's core kind of moves around, and even on the island of Japan, the core kind of goes up and down. But he doesn't make that as explicit as he could, which I think would be more interesting too, especially as he's trying to define what's the East and the West and where is that core. But there are places where he says, the knowledge dies down or it, renews afresh in another area, and that spurs growth, which is an interesting phenomena to me, or even things that are related to these types of knowledge in modern culture. So in America, Fanny Farmer wrote a cookbook and started measuring flour by volume instead of by weight. And so now almost all of cookbooks in America, if you're baking a cake, it's a cup measurement, and they say you're supposed to sift your flour and then put it in the cup and do the thing, which is a stupid way to get around the density of the flour you're using and how that affects the end result of whatever the thing is you're trying to bake. Whereas all the smart Europeans, nod to you, Tim, don't use the cup as a measurement for a flour. They use the weight measurement because that's the better thing, because every flour has a different density and a different weight. So your baked goods are going to come out better. But Fanny Farmer screwed it up.
Yeah, I mean,
Now it's a myth that every American cook.
the odd thing is, though, that what you see, as opposed to what you weigh or what you measure by volume, eventually, if you do the same recipe often enough, you don't weigh it and you just use the same size cup. It may not be a regulation cup, and my cup is actually an oversized shot glass. So I know that 3 of those of milled oats, a quarter of one of those of milled flax, or even unmilled chia seeds, gives me enough fibre to get a decent breakfast. And then it's just a case of squirt out the honey to about a teaspoon, just to give you a bit of sweetness.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
you know, your old Welsh grandmother just puts her hand in the flour bin, you know, does 3 handfuls, and that's what we do.
Yeah. I just want to keep the oats being underneath the fingernails.
Yeah. To jump back to China, it does seem like that center and periphery thing is kind of relevant to to sort of the story of the culture renewing or developing or changing, right? Because Nanjing or Chang'an is the traditional imperial capital, and it's the one that Hongwu returns to when he establishes the Ming dynasty and takes the empire back from the Mongols. But then his son, who actually rises to power in a coup, moves. He's a lesser son. He's not an heir, and but he takes over with the help of Zheng He, and then he moves the capital to Dadu or Beijing, and that which is on the northern frontier. Right, the Great Wall hasn't been built yet, but the long walls are up there, and that's and it's a frontier garrison, and that's why Zhu Di, who becomes the Yongle Emperor, was had the support of the army, was because he was up there guarding the northern border. That idea of of moving to the to the periphery and kind of making the periphery the center and getting that kind of hybrid vigor maybe, I think is more important than Morris kind of gives it credit for being, and that continual and just the thing that really strikes me about China is just its self-contained nature, right? That it has everything, unlike Japan, right, which is an island like Great Britain, and doesn't have the things, the resources that it needs to develop. China's got everything that it needs, and it's got this monster. I mean, it's got this huge territory to its east that it can expand into, and then it's got this territory to its north that it has to defend against, and so everything, its whole world is kind of right there. So so the question, every because I spend a lot of time in my world history course talking about Zheng He and his voyages and the fact that he crosses the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean and goes all the way to kind of East Africa and up into the the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz. The question always arises: well, why did they stop? What
Well, he does tell that story too of like, hey, we need to defend against these plains warriors on horses who are invading our agricultural fields and stealing from us. And so they throw a huge number of, they just burn men into the problem and lose them all, which tends to pull your social development index down because you've lost all those people who could have been doing something else.
Well,
And
there's but
it's
also
that same sort of thing we're looking at now is all the hawks say, oh, or maybe it's not Hawks right now, but it's just one idiot in charge who's saying, yeah, we're going to go bomb Iran back to the Middle Ages, and doesn't realize that's not a winning strategy. And it's literally, that literally has brought the entire World Economic Index down as a result. And it's that same issue that China was having with the Mongols early on. We're seeing it again in a modern context. When I read that story, I was like, oh my God, like, when you have somebody who doesn't understand how history works,
Mhm.
like you just repeat it all over again.
Right.
And, we've brought not only broadly lost for the US, but the entire world economy has come down. And I'm kind of curious what the social development index has done if we were to look at it from last year to this year. Are we better off or are we far worse off?
Mhm. Well, and it's not clear to me exactly how this turn away from the oceans that
Mhm.
happens after the death. It takes a while after the death of Yonko because he dies in 1424 or so, and it's not till
Yeah.
1433 that Zheng He makes his last trip, and then he dies. But within really a generation, right? There's I think a grandson of Yongle, while emperor, is captured by the Manchurians and held for ransom, right? So they and that alerts them to the fact that we really need to build a big wall, and so the Ming do, and they complete the Great Wall. It's not clear to me entirely that this is, I mean, again, we sort of play that kind of that counterfactual, counter historical game and say, well, what would have happened had they continued, had they not sort of scuttled
Yeah.
the treasure fleet and not
Yeah.
forgotten how to build these huge ships and all of that.
Or insularized. And this Japan did the same thing. It's like
Right.
we're gonna be global. No, we're gonna be insular now. Oh no, we'll go beyond our borders. Or is it illegal to build boats and sail to other places
Right. Right. And certainly
without
that does create a power vacuum in the South China Sea that, that South China coastal pirates and Japanese pirates and other people, kind of fill. And then ultimately it gets filled by the Portuguese and then the Dutch and
yeah.
whatnot. But it's not clear to me that this is really a failure or a tragedy for China up until the point at which, I mean, it does create conditions, in the same way that, that the Ottoman Empire sort of, the Janissaries refused to modernize and all of that. But it's not clear to me that it is inevitable that, that this is going to degrade China to the point where they will, because I think we haven't gotten to it yet. I think, but the big part of this, of this kind of story of East and West for me is, the arrival of Queen Victoria's, fleet of steam powered, armored
Oh,
battleships in the Yangtze Delta and the enforcement of the unequal treaty after the Opium War. So
for
I mean,
you,
and you can, and traditionally we've sort of drawn a straight line, right, from sort of the turn away from being a global power to this and saying, well, okay, they created the conditions for their own, decline.
I mean, that's a really interesting contrast, though, between what's happening in China and then Japan at the same time. When Japan, when Perry and other people come into to Japan and basically say, okay, you got the same deal that we just did this to China, we're going to do it to you.
Right.
And Japan had been pretty much in the same situation of like, oh, we're going to be a hermit for the last 300 years or whatever,
Right.
and keep everybody out.
But then they do the Meiji
And
Restoration instead.
yeah, and they completely, within decades, they are beating Russia.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're within decades, they are the massive change,
Hmm.
a massive move forward. While and I guess they had the advantage of they never got he says it, they never got colonized while China effectively did. but even before, if one wonders, what would have happened? Okay, here's the real what if. What would have happened if that one emperor had decided, you know what, we'll grow our own opium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we'd grown our own opium and taken this to an economic situation of, okay, well, your opium trade from India is no longer going to be particularly valuable to us because we're doing our own. We can do it just as well. That would have been a very different that would be an interesting counterfactual to see. And that was a choice of AI.
You say that, and then we get involved with poppy fields in Afghanistan, and we just repeat the whole thing all over again a century later.
Yeah. But the main consumer of this
so the real question is,
Afghanistan is elsewhere.
Whose poppy fields are going to influence the next century?
Yeah, now we hear. I know one of the things that, it's something that actually is a broken clock can be right once in a while, but sort of the fentanyl trade is mostly coming from the precursor stuff is mostly coming from China and screwing up the West.
Mm-hmm.
So the revenge for what we did.
Well,
to them.
tremendous irony, if not actual deliberate revenge. Yeah.
Yes.
But
yeah. Or any stimulant, tobacco, which was tobacco coming to the West from the Americas, or
tea
coming from the West to America.
You tax your tea in the wrong way in America, and suddenly you have a big revolt.
Exactly. Yeah, and the reason people care
Let's
so much
celebrate
about
that next week. Why don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. The tea is
Really?
what's the new addictive substance going to be? Yeah.
Is that something that gets celebrated? The fact that you can't pay your taxes properly because you're such a bunch of idiots. But there was a recent, I can't remember exactly where it was now, but there was a recent historical grouping that talked about the actual results of that period, and the numbers I found for that were quite interesting. But somebody came up with a number that at the point of the Boston Tea Party, the standard Brit in the British Isles was taxed 20 times more than one of you mere colonists that had to be looked after and protected.
Mm.
So you need to cough up retrospectively. We now got
we gave you all of our forests.
George III.
And I think we made up for the rest in Lend-Lease.
Yeah.
Yeah. After you meant that we had to give you all of our nuclear stuff, the jet engine, the hovercraft, etc., and all the bases for free. Yeah. So I was thinking now it's Charlie III. He ought to take back what Georgie III lost.
Well, all that, and
numerical
if
symmetry.
Haiti had a bigger army, they would not still be paying the French.
Yeah. So
poor Haiti.
We've gone off the rails.
We've gone off the rails. Well, we've gone off the rails of East and West. Yeah.
I like where it ends up. I like where it ends up when he says, okay, all this, he doesn't actually, we do finally get the important part. Like, okay, it's not this, it's not that, it's not the other, it's geography. He finally just said, okay, look, it's geography. That's what the difference. That's what the difference was. It's not racial this or cultural that. It's geography. So
I must admit, when I saw the Mediterranean in chapter 6 and 7, the Mediterranean coming up time and time again, here's all the coastline, here's the way out, and there's the land route out. I'm going, but in a couple of centuries, British Empire, so here's the British Isles, there's all that coast and all that trade going this way. And the reason that is protected as much as it was is because Napoleon couldn't cross the sea, and neither could the Spanish, the 200 years before Napoleon. And then, of course, 200 years later again. couldn't cross the sea or didn't cross the sea. So
And-
geography
Mhm.
works well.
Okay. And similarly, I mean, the main reason in the 20th century, it's all of Europe gets completely destroyed. A huge death toll in Europe for all this war going on, while North America is sitting there with two giant oceans on either sides of it. He mentions there's Pearl Harbor was very minor, and there was only there was exactly one attack from the Japanese. A plane on the mainland U.S. There was a plane that was launched from a submarine that went against someplace in Oregon. Yeah,
So you're saying,
series.
by that argument, you're saying Hitler's biggest flaw was starting a war while his country was in the middle of everything, which then brings the war to you.
I mean, it's not. He had plenty of flaws, but
Yeah, and no oil.
I think I think the big flaw was
No oil.
it was the same as Napoleon's, marching into Russia in the summertime.
yes.
Yeah.
Never do a land war in Europe. Never do a land war in Asia.
Right.
What's the
Right.
it's
Only slightly less well known is this. Never go
But
against the Sicilian when death
if
is on the line.
if the error is walking into Russia in the summer, because you then don't know what happens in winter. Imagine what would have been. It would have been like if you'd started in winter, so that you were there further in when springtime came, as in 43, and you still get beat.
Yeah, well, if you remember too, you go back to Roman history, they literally changed their calendars and added the 2 months onto the beginning of the calendar so that when you started your consulship, you were ready for the war season like on day one, instead of having to wait for the winter to finish before you sent all your people off. Because if you can only be consul for a shorter amount of wartime, you're going to be less effective.
Right. Well, and the Nazis' fuel trains were horse-drawn. So, so you couldn't have invaded Russia. You couldn't have begun your invasion in the winter with the Blitzkrieg.
Well, and then there's the other. Well, but to get also to the never starting a land war in Asia. I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, because I probably am, but it's really more don't invade Ukraine. If you think about it, I mean, the Napoleon went in. It was that part of the Russian Empire that sort of bled everything to death, and then that part of the of the Soviet Union bled the Nazis. And well, I mean, you coming the other way, it's also not a great way to go. It's sort of a dead end no matter where you go. It's a great big marshy place that gets really cold.
Or it's getting admired into places that you can't win immediately in. And then you spend weeks or months or even years, think Vietnam, where you're just bleeding material without any actual gains. And it's the same with China and the Mongols.
It's the counter argument to Morris's putting the size of the principal city first as a factor in that, in category one, right? Because by the time the Spanish arrive in the Yucatan, the Maya don't live in cities anymore, right? And so of all of the nations that of Mesoamerica that that the Spanish come up against, they don't defeat the Maya ever, right? Because they're so, by that time they're so decentralized and they can't be conquered in a decisive battle or where a city is taken. And and basically that's what the Spaniards did, was they took cities and they inserted their own rulers at the top of these hierarchies.
Yeah.
And that was the collapse of the sort of the Byzantine Empire, the biggest, Constantinople was the biggest, huge city,
Mhm.
and it became like a shell of itself within 50 years or whatever, because uh,
I really liked
the
that
Turkish
passage. I highlighted that passage of because it hadn't really occurred to me that that Constantinople went through these changes, and and at one point he says the suburbs were put back into into agricultural production and stuff, and and plowed over, and I was like, oh yeah,
You should go. It's a nice place.
mhm.
Well, he pieces of this are phenomenally good primers for how to rule an area in certain times and certain places, and he's got some really good advice. There was a thing I highlighted on page 281, and he essentially says repressive institutions are good for conquering, not ruling.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Which as you sit and you watch what Trump is doing in America, he's creating a repressive institution for ruling, while at the same time he's saying, just make America great again and ignore the other stuff. When in fact, what he really should be doing is taking his repressive business and going overseas and using it to conquer the Iranians and rule, if that's what he wants to do,
You
that's
mean
what this,
liberate?
well, or liberate or whatever you're going to do. But the issue though is you also have to read Machiavelli, and then
Mhm.
unless you're going to send your people from here to go live there to rule over them, you are never going to win.
Mhm.
Never.
Yeah.
And that's one of the issues we've always had with the Middle East is Israel, at least they're there. They're living there. It's a thing. But America is not sending colonists to the Middle East to live and rule there. And as a result, Machiavelli says we would never ever win. Um,
Well,
Now,
Well,
if you
the,
want to send your
that's
colonists
interestingly,
to
that's something
live
that
on Guam, you're going to rule Guam. And guess what?
yeah, well, and that's
There's
something that
not,
Hong Wu did too, right? Is he sent a
Yeah.
lot of people to the eastern frontier. He relocated a lot of peasant farmers and planted a billion trees. But and that was and I mean and I guess you could argue in the West in America we had that that century of manifest destiny as we spread out across the the North American continent before um, to some extent we started looking over oceans and thinking about a deep water fleet and all of that Teddy Roosevelt stuff.
yeah. Anyway, it's geography.
It's geography.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's geography.
That's it.
Which we already knew from 1999 from reading, Jared Diamond's book, who is referenced in this and who also we know from the foreword read and reviewed over this. So
Mhm.
Yeah.
he's just adding to
Great
that.
word. Yeah.
Yep. It's geography,
Adding to
but
that.
is it geographical determinism?
Yeah.
Wait, so for next week, are we going to finish it?
Part is the future, right? The next part is like, okay, what's going to happen?
Well, assuming
Yeah.
assuming
Are
we
you gonna
actually
win?
did, it seems to me like we sort of stalled in chapter 8, but but we could read
Oh.
9 through 12 for next week.
Yeah, when we finish it, because
Yeah.
the last two chapters are quite short.
Okay. All right. Why don't we finish it then? I won't be that sad to leave this one behind. It was not necessarily my favorite. I am kind of looking forward to a Lisa Jardine. Although the thing about Stuart Brand sounded kind of interesting too, that came up in.
Oh, did we decide on Lisa Jardine specific?
We didn't really. We
We
talked
narrowed
about
it down to like one or two, I think. And
the going Dutch
two or four, I think,
or
is
or
more
the
like.
other
but
one.
if we decide, I can buy it and it might get here in time.
There you go.
So Jardine,
So I guess it was mostly between Worldly Goods, which was from 1996, and Going Dutch, which is I think much more focused, but has the benefit of being from 2008. So I'd be okay with
And
Worldly Goods, though.
Tim has read several of these, right?
Yeah.
But I'm trying to
Going
recall
Dutch,
Tim had a
Lisa
preference.
Jardine.
Tim, do you think Worldly Goods is still current enough?
all of the ones we're considering and a couple more from Jardine I've read,
Mhm.
but I can read again.
Okay.
I still thought our choices was the Enlightenment or the Dutch one. But I can't remember exactly what the two
Well,
titles.
the Enlightenment one is called Worldly Goods: A New History of the Renaissance, isn't it?
But
Yeah,
new being from 1990 something.
1996.
yeah. It's an older book, but it's really the actual proper most of
On the
it.
other hand, some people
rephrase that.
sometimes
I
sometimes
rephrase
people
that. Most
continue
of
to
it.
develop the same idea. So maybe it's
But-
valuable to look at an early expression of the idea.
Yeah, it's the history book that is basically the history book that is also the Baroque cycle from.
Yeah. I mean, if I were
Whatever his name was.
gonna choose from a Heather Cox Richardson book, for example, I would probably choose, one of her first couple, because those would have been the most academically oriented, kind of thesis driven ones, rather than the, kind of the more recent pop kind of ones. So I could be convinced to read Worldly Goods. There was another one that had a lot of votes that was about kind of about globalization, right? Or the David Lynch one, The World's West Bet, how the globalization gamble went wrong and what would make it right. And that has the benefit of having come out less than a year ago. But
So should we do Worldly Goods and then that
yeah,
at the end of the summer?
yeah, okay. Yeah, it'll still only be a year old if we do it at the end of the summer.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. So we'll finish this next week, and then the following week we'll move on to Worldly Goods. All right.
Cool beans.
Great. Thank you. Have a
Have a
good
good one.
have a good rest of your weekend.